Um, so without more ado, I'm going to invite our first guest speaker to begin. That's Iskander Abbasi. Iskander is a Palestinian-American PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg. His work focuses on the fields of Islamic liberation theology, decolonial studies, Islamophobia studies, and Muslim environmental ethics. He's been involved in Palestine solidarity in the USA and South Africa with organizations such as the National Students for Justice in Palestine and Africa for Palestine. Welcome, Iskander. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephen. Can people hear me okay? Okay, marhaba, ahlan wa sahlan. Greetings to all during everybody's various Holy Week at the moment. My name is Iskander, and I am speaking to you from Johannesburg, South Africa, where I have lived for basically the last decade. But I am originally from, everybody here is sharing where they're speaking from. So I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I am a Palestinian American, come South African of sorts. And I am here with you today to speak and share a bit about the topic of Islamophobia. And the way I'd like to approach the topic today will basically be kind of a bit of the history of where this term comes from. Just in terms of people using the word Islamophobia to describe Islamophobia, but then conceptually what it means. I'm going to go into kind of a very long history of Islamophobia. Many people may not know, but it has a very long history in the world, much longer than many might think. So I'm going to be going into periods in time, kind of very behind us in many ways, but maybe in certain ways not. And then if there's a bit of time at the end of the presentation, I'll try to touch a bit on Islamic political theology and notions of extremism. It might be tough to get there, but given that this is what this webinar series is about, religious extremism in the place of religion, I'll try to get to that, but let's see what we work through. Right, so firstly, Islamophobia. The first time that Islamophobia, that term itself was used, was about 100 years ago. And it was used by a very interesting character by the name of Ivan Ageli, who was a Swedish man and a Muslim Sufi who was an anarchist and an impressionist painter and someone deeply involved in different kind of mystical societies in Europe and in the Arab world. He traveled to Egypt for a number of years and Sufism, and many scholars have come to the conclusion that this was the first time the term Islamophobia was ever used. If we fast forward a bit in history, the term became popular in France in terms of different migrants of Muslim heritage who were encountering forms of racism in France. And the term really kind of explodes in a few decades after that, really after 9/11. And you have the development of a field of study called Islamophobia studies. And there are a number of scholars across the world, in the United States, in Europe, in different places in Africa and Asia, in Latin America, really all over the world now, who work on Islamophobia studies. And there are a few different networks involved in holding seminars around studying Islamophobia historically and in terms of contemporary issues. So what is Islamophobia? Now, etymologically, the term means fear of Islam. But many scholars argue against approaching this term in that way. They say that the meaning of Islamophobia is not necessarily its literal etymology, but it means something along the lines of anti-Muslim racism or anti-Muslimness. In many ways similar to the ways that the term anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism is used. And many people have become familiar with the term, especially in the post 9/11 context. But Islamophobia has existed long, long before 9/11. And there's a need to kind of challenge the narrative that Islamophobia is a post 9/11 phenomenon. So generally in studies of racism, many people look at the development of racism coming from Europe, if we're talking about Western racism, as going back to the late 15th century. The post 1492 world is really how many people approach the question of when does Western racism start. 1492, of course, is when Europe kind of breaks away from its peninsular ghetto. You have explorers like Christopher Columbus or Vasco da Gama who go out into places outside of the peninsula and begin to encounter other peoples in tandem with colonial missions. So colonialism is very much tied to racism, and kind of scholars across different fields of studying anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, many different kinds of anti-Asian racism, they view kind of the beginning of modern Western racism as stemming from this period, kind of attached to European colonial expansion. Why is that also important in relation to Islam and Islamophobia? Well, how does this moment occur? On one hand, you have the destruction of what we can call an Islamic or Islamicate civilization, Al-Andalus. It was also an Arabo civilization. People were Arabic speaking in the civilization. Many people refer to it as Islamic Spain and refer to a period of convivencia between Muslim, Jews, and Christians, and kind of the height of a certain form of pluralism, a religious pluralism, civilizational pluralism in the world. And when Al-Andalus is destroyed by the local European powers, that's virtually the beginning of Europe going beyond the peninsula and exporting some of the notions that they had about race to other peoples. So one important date and period, is 1492, the end of Al-Andalus and European colonial expansion. But in order to see where Islamophobia kind of historically develops, you need to go kind of before 1492 and after 1492. So the kind of the founding of what we might call a type of systemic notion of Islamophobia really occurs during the medieval Crusades, right? So what were the Crusades? The Crusades were a time period in history wherein Western Christendom, Western Christian powers were attempting to create peace internal to Western Christendom via external war. And the main kind of enemy was the Muslim. There were many other enemies in kind of the imaginary of Western Christendom, and the enemies were marked by differences in race and religion. So basically, anyone who was a non-white, a non-European, and a non-Christian become marked as other, lesser than, and inferior during this time period. And this is kind of a unique development in the history of the land. That's Western Christendom, what becomes Europe, and what was there before. Because prior to the development of this idea of Western Christendom, you of course have the Roman Empire, which, kind of there's a Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was multi-ethnic, right? And kind of in the historiography of what becomes Western Christendom, in the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire disintegrates, and from the 5th to 10th centuries AD, they describe this period as the Dark Ages. Many people have challenged the notion of the Dark Ages, but this is the way that Western Christendom started to view itself. And for various reasons during that time period, including movements by ecclesiastical leadership in the Catholic Church, and also various polities and political leaders in coming from the different polities in Western Christendom, you have this kind of burgeoning idea of race that gets developed, and Islamophobia is very much a part of that. The Muslim is marked as other, and is kind of an eternal enemy to be crusaded against, killed, colonized, or converted. And it's tied to other forms of racism. So when you look at just the event of the First Crusade itself, it kind of encapsulates many things still dealing with until this day around notions of race and religion. The initial crusade that marched across Western Christendom, one of the first acts that was engaged was a massacre of Jews in the Rhineland, in what is today the Rhineland region of Germany. And many scholars of anti-Semitism mark that as one of the first systemic expressions of anti-Semitism. Then you have the Crusaders going through Eastern Byzantium and all the way to Palestine. And the Eastern Christians are attacked. And when they land and create a Crusader state for just over a century in historic Palestine, these are not my words, but you basically have the creation of kind of an apartheid state. And the scholar I first encountered describing the Crusader state in Palestine as an apartheid state is actually an Israeli scholar of Crusader studies by the name of Prower. And you have basically a Western Christian crusading, colonizing elite who basically create hierarchies of racial and religious difference to all those below them. And there were immediate massacres of Muslims and Jews in historic Palestine, and also forms of subjugation against Eastern Christians. So many people think, that this crusading spirit might have ended with the end of formal crusades, in the 1400s. That's when many people kind of mark the end of formal crusading. But historically, it's not the case. This kind of crusading spirit merges into the modern European colonial expansion, and really colors the way phobia and all forms of racism develop. So I mean, when people on that the people who went on the boat with Columbus, for example, or let's even say Vasco da Gama, who goes to the east and ends up in India. Both of them, by the way, are looking for a mythical Christian figure by the name of Prester John, who is supposed to help the Western Christians unite to reconquer Palestine. Those missions, when they encountered, let's say, Native Americans in the Americas, or even during the transatlantic slave trade, they transferred certain Islamophobic notions onto the indigenous people. They called their religious structures, mosques. They identified some of their indigenous festivals as festivals they'd experienced in relation to Muslims or even Jews. And this process, now I'm going to fast forward a bit, over the next 500 years, really, continues to develop. And I mean, we can go into kind of a more extensive history of all the different instances of kind of European colonialism in the Muslim world. But like the rest of the world, it's pretty easy to explain. Europe colonizes everybody. So Islamophobia becomes central to the European civilizing mission. And I think one thing that's important to mention, and I mean, you even see it, you saw Bush, the President George W. Bush Jr., I mean, made comments in reference to the Crusades. You still have Crusader elements in many aspects of Western societies, in popular culture, in video games, and especially on the far right. Even, if you look at other forms of racism, like racism, organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, who were created to police and murder Black people, many of their costumes and symbols come from kind of a Crusader imagination. So, I mean, that's kind of a broad historical way of understanding where Islamophobia comes from. But I just want to give two kinds of other aspects of Islamophobia, if I have the time. I'm not sure the speaker can share with me how much time I have left. Okay, I think I'm getting a thumbs up. So one is to understand that in the context of, okay, so there's three kind of ways people often approach racism. One of them is through a biological notion of people having biological things that are impure. So notions of purity of blood or phenotype or skin color are often used in systems of racism. Another are kind of cultural forms of racism, where cultural practices or beliefs are marked as inferior through a notion of race in racism. And there's a third one, and it's one that's often not mentioned in studies of racism. And it's political racism. And this is tied to the ways in which people who are racially othered, when they express their political agency, they're policed and experience forms of exclusion or genocide or oppression. One way this works itself out with Islamophobia, I think the other easy to Muslim from Africa or Asia, they're brown-skinned, or they have a funky name, or they speak a different language. These are the kinds of cultural and biological forms of racism. But in terms of Islamophobia at a global scale, and particularly in relation to Islamic political theology, political Islamophobia is one of the most strident forms of Islamophobia, and that's basically policing Muslim attempts at political autonomy. And whether you want to frame this, let's say in the context of Western countries, where Muslims are fighting for their political rights through social movements or political organizations that are asserting forms of autonomy, or in the Muslim world itself, particularly through political Islamist movements who are critiquing forms of basically secular Islamophobia in Muslim countries. Yeah, these political Islamist movements in many contexts have been policed and experienced a form of otherization due to a political form of Islamophobia. Right. So I think I have kind of gone for 15 minutes. And I'm okay with wrapping up now. I would have liked to have gotten a bit into some contemporary stuff around political Islam in Palestine, but I think that's a good amount for people to chew on. Yeah, so thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you, Iskander. We would like to hear a bit more from you, but there'll be time for that maybe in the Q&A. Thank you so much. That was very, very illuminating and very helpful to get historical perspective, and particularly the prevailing influence of the Crusader mentality even today. It's very distressing, very upsetting. So thank you Iskander, for your very challenging, very helpful presentation. We were due to have Mariam Bougouti speak to us this evening today, but unfortunately she is unable to do so. So we hope we're going to hear from Mariam at one of our future webinars, but certainly at the conference. She is one of our speakers lined up for the conference. So we'll have a little bit more time for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat so that Santiago and Iskander can have time to think about their answers. But I'd like to now introduce our second guest speaker, and that's Santiago Slabotsky. Santiago is an Argentinian social theorist who holds the Kaufman Chair in Jewish Studies at Hofstra University in New York. His book, Decolonial Judaism, was recognized with the Franz Fanon Outstanding Book Award by the CPA. So welcome, Santiago.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and hello everyone from everywhere you are in the world. This is a perfect timing for those of us in the US since it's just early afternoon, so I am a little bit more awake. I will be in most of my talks when it happened in Palestine. And I just want to address one important issue, first of all, which is it's very rare in a post-pandemic world where an activity that has more than 100 people together in one place. So many congratulations for everyone and Civil, that's represented by Stephen now, but everyone Civil for actually making this happen. I am sure that you haven't noticed at all that I cannot have a little accent. So since I was unable to secure subtitles for me, what I did was to bring a PowerPoint that will help me a little bit as subtitles for you to see a little bit what I was saying. Everyone can see my PowerPoint? People can see the PowerPoint? Yes? Yeah? Iskander, can see the PowerPoint? Good, perfect. So, wonderful. So let me just start with this and tell you a little bit what I am going to be talking today. I'm going to continue many of the wonderful contributions that Iskander has brought to us. Some of it will be a repetition, but most of it is going to be complementary. So I will be talking about why we can decolonize Islamophobia. And the particular target I am going to be using today is I'm going to decolonize it in a place where people don't expect to decolonize it, which is through Jewish-Muslim relations. So let me start a little bit with this image, if you can see it. This image is a meme that has gone through a lot of times. I'm going to particularly focus in that first square you have in the left side of your right or left side of your screen. And most of the time when actually these kind of memes come in the public scene, the questions that you're going to have in popular conversation in the media is, are Muslims terrorists, fanatics, and anti-Semitic? How the situation in Palestine can reveal something about what is called the Muslim mind. This is what you are going to see popularly out there. Today, I am going to challenge that a little bit and actually talk a little bit about, sorry, you can see the screen now? Yeah, perfect. I'm going to talk in a little bit about a different kind of questions I want to ask. I don't want to ask what is, I want to ask how it came to be, why it came to be, when it came to me, and what are the outcomes. So I'm going to be asking us how, when, and why the concept of Muslim terrorism, fanaticism, anti-Semitism came to be, what is at stake in this narrative of Muslim eternal enmity with Jews that is particularly important in terms of Palestine, what interest it serves, and what is the final outcome. So I'm going to challenge, as I mentioned before, this question through Muslim-Jewish relationships. Most of the time when we see in popular media Jewish-Muslim relationship, what is presented is Muslims have hated Jews from immemorial, which most of them are called biblical times, and this is what created the situation in Israel-Palestine. And this is going to be, for the West, a clear example of Muslim essential fanaticism and terrorism. But the question I'm going to explain today is not if this is true or not, but how and why we started to talk about this Muslim essence that is a central call of Islamophobia. I'm going to propose an alternative reading. This alternative reading is going to explain this idea of eternal hatred doesn't have more than 70 to 150 years. That if we actually look at what is called medieval and modern history, which is a little bit what Iskander explained before, Muslim ruled lands were more a space of refuge for Jews from Western Christian persecution than a place where Jews were attacked, because Jews in those contexts have a clear protected legal status, and historically makes more sense until at least the 13th century, and some even say until the 1950s, to talk about a Judeo-Islamic over a Judeo-Christian tradition. So what we're going to talk finally, and that's going to be my conclusion, is that there is a paradox that Muslims are seen as fanatics because the persecution of Jews, when actually, historically speaking, was the space where Jews found refuge. And that inversion, the paradox, is a historical product of Christian Western colonialism. My starting point here is going to be something that Iskander criticized very well before, which is 1492. So I'm going to start from 1492, understanding that this is not the only place where we can start. I wrote this before I heard Iskander because we have been in dialogue for over a decade now, so I knew he was going to explain this very, very well. And he has already talked a little bit about these precursors of what here could be studied as Crusader spirit that will attack not only Muslims, but also Jews. But today, for the sake of space, I'm going to talk about 1492. As Iskander said before, this was a simultaneous symbolic point of the colonization of the south of Spain, an expulsion of Jews and Muslims, and the colonization of the Americas, where the West is going to launch a program of global conquest that by 1914 will be conquered over 80% of the world and influence 100%. So the question is, how is a population that was never more than 8 to 12% in the best estimates of the world launched a conquest to occupy all the spaces that you are going to see in that top map as green? Why? I would just say, yes, it was through weapons, but not only. It was also through the power of discourse and the imposition of this discourse that emerged from political theology. So what is this political theology I am talking about? In the 17th century, there was a development of a tripartite understanding of the world, where the whole world was divided in 3 major groups: people with true religion, people with false religion, and people with no religion. The people with true religion, which are going to be Western Christians, are going to be the community that is endowed with the ultimate truth and has the responsibility to bring the world to religious salvation, and then it's going to be translated through the years as cultural civilization, economical development, and those in the Middle East know very well today, political democratization. I am not criticizing civilization, economic development, political democratization. I am criticizing the narratives about them in order to justify redemptive violence. When Israel presents itself as the only democracy of the Middle East, the one who developed the country at the start of the boom, has to do with this conception of the true path, of the only path. There was a second community of people, which is going to be generated, what Iskander talked before about as Orientalism. Communities will be defined as having the wrong path, that consciously have rejected or betrayed the ultimate truth, are either stuck on time or they are working against civilization with open wars, most of the time Muslims, or conspiracies, most of the time Jews. Ultimately, one the other is going to be conflicted. And now we can talk, especially in many places, also about Muslim conspiracies. This is going to be a threat of a violence that will mark an imperial difference between the West and the Oriental rest. And where this is happening, even though it's completely true what Iskander said before, that there are antecedents of constructions of racist thinking before 1492, in the 15th, 16th century is where we are going to have a genealogical turn, which means people are going to be presumed impurity according to their heritage. So converting Muslims and Jews to Christianity will not be enough. They will have an impure blood that will make them always suspicious of not being loyal enough to Western Christianity. Later, we have another group, another community of people who are understood as no religion, who are going to be communities who fell off of the Christian map, and the resources from land to labor are going to be considered virgin territories. And as such, their violence is going to always seen as reactive. That indicates that they are ignorant of the advancements of civilization. And that is going to mark not imperial difference, but a colonial difference. What I'm going to argue here is that the 16th century is very important, even though Iskander is right that you are going to see elements beforehand, because the global hegemony was constructed between this genealogical term that makes people unable to overcome who they are for the impurity of the blood. It doesn't matter how much you want to convert to Christianity, Jews or Muslims are not going to be allowed to do it. And the ontological term, which means some people are going to be understood as not being human enough and need to be helped to become human. So why I am saying I'm going to decolonize Islamophobia through the Jewish-Muslim relation? Because as I mentioned before, Jews and Muslims have been co-racialized. Today, we are seeing them as opposite, but hasn't been always the case. Before 1482, Jews have lived among Arabs and later among Muslims, some Arabs have not, between 2,500 years, for example, in Iraq, to 700, 800 years, for example, in North Africa. Jews under Islam fare much better than under Christianity because they have a clear protected legal status. Al-Kitab, or people of the book, that later on is going to be translated into Arabic or Turkish as Dimi or Zimet. In the 15th, 16th century, when Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain, to 17th century, the final expulsion of Muslims, and the Ottomans will take Constantinople, that will become Istanbul, Jews fled from Western Christian Europe into the Muslim lands. As a consequence, between the 16th and 18th century, Jewish population in the Ottoman Empire multiplied by 8 times. Why? Because Jews escaped to Muslim lands. That doesn't mean Jews always have it good in Muslim lands. Things happen. But Jews were an integral part of the fabric of the Muslim societies. So this central idea of Islamophobia, that that Muslims are always fanatics, they never care about diversity between their lands, they are always attacking and hating Jews, it doesn't work at all. If we look at this longer history, we are going to see that actually Jews have had a much better life in Muslim lands than in Christian Europe. So between 16th and 18th century, racial thinking has merged Jews and Muslims. Different racial structures have made them be co-racialized. And this is why Palestinian Edward Said writes in the famous Orientalism, anti-Semitism, as I have discussed in Islamic branch Orientalism, resemble each other very closely in a historical, cultural, political truth that needs only to be mentioned to a Palestinian for its irony to be perfectly understood. So what Said was telling us is there is an intimate relation in the Western construction of Jews and Muslims that we need to understand from a Palestinian perspective how ironic this situation is. And I want to repeat, Muslim lands, more times than not, have been a land of refuge for Jews when they were attacked in Western Christianity. So the question is, if there is this long history of the Judeo-Islamic, and there is this very, very hard situation between the Judeo-Christian, when we think about one of the causes of Islamophobia, which is this fanaticism, this lack of, this attempt of of eradicate diversity. What happened with this history of Jewish-Muslim relations? Something happened in the 19th, 20th century. In the 19th century, there was a Western colonization, first of all, in North Africa and then the Middle East. It started with the French, but later on extended with English, French, and others, English, German, and others. And there was a common strategy. What was the strategy? The strategy was to elevate a minority population as elite in order to collaborate with colonization. It is true, Jews were among those minorities that they were elevated and given opportunities, but they were not the only ones. Copts also feel the same thing in Egypt, Tutsis in Rwanda, and we are going to see multiple, even native groups in the Americas as well. By the 20th century, this attempt of divide Jewish and Muslim population was a colonial project. But even then, I will argue today, it was not broken until half of the 20th century. The success of this break of Jewish-Muslim relations didn't happen after Al-Nakba in 1948, or even better said, the Suez Crisis in 1956. Why I am saying that the relation was not broken? Why I am saying that many Jews trusted in Muslim-ruled lands, or Muslim majority lands, better said, for their projects? Zionism is a Jewish political project, one I do not like, one I have written enough about, one that unfortunately is constructing a genocide today in Palestine. But that was never the only Jewish political projects. There were other political projects. Some of them I am more sympathetic, some of them I am not, that they were reduced as Zionism as the only possibility for Jewish political participation. But that was not the case until the 1950s. Let me give you some examples. In Egypt, in the 1870s, Yaqut Sanua, that was the founder and leader of the journal Abu Nadara, the magazine Abu Nadara, he coined the slogan, Egypt for Egyptians. If Jews could not live in Muslim majority areas, why is a Jew who is going to coin this slogan, Egypt for Egyptians? If Muslims have always hated the Jews, and the central part of the Muslim mind is the hatred for anything differently, why a Jew will actually coin the term Egypt for Egyptians? Doesn't make any sense. 1940s, Mohammed V, who is going to become the king of Morocco, is going to call for a Muslim, Jewish, Berber national movement to kick the French out from Morocco in the 1940s. Again, if Jews cannot live in a majority Muslim land, why Mohammed V is going to be calling for this? In Iraq, a lot of Jews participating. We are part of this ancient pre-Islamic community that came from the destruction of the first temple in minus 586. And they were completely integrated in what is called the culture and politics of Arab Judaism. So last two slides in order to conclude what I'm trying to say. The first one is going to be about paradoxes, and the second one, lessons. The paradoxes are the following. The first paradox about Muslims. So Muslims are portrayed as being fanatics and terrorists, when this history of Jewish-Muslim relations shows the opposite. Jews find in Muslim-ruled land a space of refuge, did not find, in comparison to Western Christianity, a place of persecution in the same level. There is a special role that Palestinians, and this is an interesting thing, Palestinians are negated sovereignty because there is understanding that Muslim rule cannot guarantee Jewish life. When historically, Jewish life was guaranteed by Muslim rule against Christian rule. So Muslims are portrayed as historically fanatics and terrorists. The historical record show that Muslims have welcomed Jews much more than Western Christians. What happened with Jews like myself? Those who have been persecuted by centuries and centuries before 1492, as Iskander very well said before, finished in only a few decades representing this construction of the Western Judeo-Christian civilization, adopting salvation through the same nation state that attempt to annihilate Jews in Europe. I am not saying, and I want to be clear, that my problem with Zionism is exceptional. No, I am saying that the problem of Zionism is that it's very ordinary. Zionism is acting as a Western, as a representative of Western nation state, and is acting as this Western nation state, annihilating difference there. The problem of Zionism is not exceptionality, even though there are some particularities, all historical particularities. The problem of Zionism is that it is an ordinary Western nation state. There are protests, disengagements, and returns of many young Jews to other political options, and is slowly becoming a true option. And this is why many Jews who object to Zionism today are under persecution. No comparison persecution with what Palestinians are suffering today, but following Palestinians suffer today. What happened with the paradox of Western Christians? The ones who initiated the conflict between Muslims and Jews, now they present themselves as the only rational actor who can moderate and can be in charge of the solution. This is why every time I see in the US someone talking about public policy, I say, no, thank you. And this is why I bring an Uruguayan thinker, Eduardo Galeano, who once asked, if you could talk to the president of the US, what you will ask? And he answered, please stay away. The West is not a rational moderate actor. The West is an interest part in this conflict. And originally, the West is the one that created. And then the paradox of Christian Palestinians. As Iskander said before, that in the Crusades, the Eastern Christian community suffered. Christian Palestinians are only recognized as actors to be saved, not as agents, not as actors of the process, who have much more in common with Muslim Palestinians than with Western Christians. Very, very last slide I'm going to offer today, if Stephen allow me to. Jewish-Muslim eternal enmity is not eternal. It's a colonial fabrication following European and later on American geopolitical intervention and incorporation of normative Jews to this process to contract a post-Judeo-Christian tradition and the reinforcement of a narrative about the Muslim or terrorist mind, which is a narrative. It's not historically accurate. And looking about Jewish-Muslim relations can show that historically that is not right. Today, those who instrumentalize anti-Semitism post-October 7, for example, in the US Congress hearing, show both the pinnacle of those narratives and also the crudeness of the imperial strategy. And I'm going to ask today how this history of Jewish-Muslim relations that show that Jews have lived for a very long time in Muslim-majority lands, much better in Western Christian lands, can change our conception of the debate about Israel-Palestine. And I will ask us to not to keep insisting on narratives of the system, but instead interrogating the system. Western Christian intervention is not pacific and is not neutral. It has been the cause of the problem and is the side that is too big to be seen, and Gil Kochberg has expressed. Given the power of Western Christianity, it's necessary sometimes to incorporate it to this history, but cannot claim neutral objectivity because there are interested parts. And finally, I'm going to say the following, and because Stephen asked us what follows, what we can do afterwards. The future will not be just about identities. Western Christians cannot keep arrogating themselves having the superior Christian path. Jews cannot arrogate themselves as having the only security under Western Christianity. I believe that the solution for this is to look at what the grassroots movements are doing, because they might be bringing different possibilities of dialogue, different possibilities of relationship that challenge instead of reproducing the system. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Santiago, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very helpful to have the PowerPoint and particularly your historical perspective, exposing the reality that it's Western colonial fabrication that's created this tension between Muslim Jews and Christians. And it's very helpful to see how Jews particularly were fared better under Islamic rule than they have sadly under Christian rule. So thank you so much, Santiago, and we look forward to dialoguing with you in a moment with a Q&A, which Mark is going to lead, and also looking forward to your contribution to the conference in November. So thank you. If you wish to ask a question of Iskander or Santiago, please put it in the chat, and I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who's going to lead us in the Q&A. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Stephen. It's right, I couldn't get it to unmute. I think in the first instance, I'd like to ask Iskander and Santiago whether they want to comment on each other's talk and whether they specifically have a question between themselves. I know they said they've been working together for 10 years, so they've probably answered everything. But is there anything that either of you want to ask the other in terms of what you've both said?
I can start a little bit. I believe it is important to start hearing different experiences in different places. We have been insisting, my work among them, on this 1492 as this moment of eruption of racism, because many of us have been seeing this transatlantically, which means things are happening through Atlantic. What Iskander's presentation offers us is the possibility of looking a little bit beyond that and start dialogue with each other a little bit more, understanding that racism travels, colorism travels, and ideas travel, power travel, resources travel. So I believe that this long history that Iskander is presenting can help us to illuminate that this is not an issue that is eternal on the one hand, but it's not an issue that has to do with essentialism of Christianity of Islam. It has to do with political projects. We can create other Christianities, for example, and people have created other Christianities, but they need to acknowledge the power of the narrative of Christian triumphalism, especially in Western triumphalism that contains the Crusader spirit. So I think that that emphasis on Iskander of looking at this Christian triumphalism when Western Christianity was still provincial is very, very, very important to go to the root of the problem. So I'm very thankful for the long-standing work that Iskander has done on this, okay, and learning from him.
Thank you, Santiago. Iskander would like to say something, but I think he was muted. So if the person hosting it would please unmute him, he can then comment. There we go.
I was going to jump in first and say, I don't want to say anything. Santiago's my sheikh. He's my I don't know. I think maybe one thing to zero in on in this whole conversation is Palestine. And I think it's important for this moment, but I mean, it's important just historically in relation to Islamophobia, because in many ways, Palestine is the foundation of Islamophobia, because the crusading, the crusade spirit extended has always had the reconquering of Palestine as central. And for me, in many ways, this is why this moment is proving that Palestine is the beginning, and in my opinion, inshallah, the end of Western colonialism. I mean, I know times are very bleak at the moment. We don't want to make anything seem rosy. But when you know how decolonization happens, and when you study it historically in different contexts, you know that moments like this are a sign that things are becoming unsustainable. Things will continue to become more chaotic, but there's going to be a shift because by necessity it has to happen. And many scholars are saying this, including Israeli scholars like Ilan Pape, who are arguing that we are seeing the beginning of the end. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. And what we should do in this time period is try to create greater unity amongst Palestine solidarity movements, and also, internal to the Palestinian national movement. There needs to be greater unity there so that we can overcome the ugliest phase of Zionism and Islamophobia and the perpetual attempt to colonize Palestine. In relation to what Santiago said, I think he really outlined well the way in which Orientalism and Islamophobia and the dynamics with Jewish-Muslim relations, it's really kind of in the 20th century, in a post-World War II moment, where you have this idea of the Judeo-Christian civilization becoming, reality, and the Jewish aspect of that becoming a temporal Westernness, of course, through a perverted philo-Semitism. But I'd like to say that, Judeo-Christian civilization is a religious expression of Western Islamophobia, but a secular expression of that is what we might call a Zionist Crusader alliance. And a number of particularly Arab scholars, but also Muslim scholars in the 20th century have used this analogy to talk about what happens with this long-term Western history of anti-Semitism, and then all of a sudden you get to the end of the 19th century, 20th century, and you form an alliance, you front this ideology of Zionism, which of course we all know comes from Christianity. Christian Zionism precedes Jewish Zionism. I don't want to go as far as saying, I'm fully with the notion that Zionism is not Judaism as an ethical point to be made, and as, but there is an actual formation of Judaism as Zionism. What we might call the secular expression of that in relation to this longue durée, project of Western civilization is kind of a Zionist Crusader or Judeo-Christian civilizational alliance. Of course, I think it's a betrayal of what Jewish and Jewish-Muslim Christian relations should be globally and in Palestine. I think we have much better examples to learn from historically. Al-Andalus, everybody talks about Al-Andalus, but Al-Andalus was everywhere. Al-Andalus was in North Africa, Al-Andalus was in Palestine, Al-Andalus was in the Ottoman Empire, Al-Andalus was in South Asia, Al-Andalus was in all of these places. In terms of, kind of secular and religious pluralism existing to an extent. And I think that in approaching the moment, there's going to be a unique way we try to figure this out. And it's right now, it's very difficult to think about it, given how, the Israeli state and to a large extent, civil society is hell-bent on this genocide. But it's important. Santiago's point that we need to come and interrogate power in order to do otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. This I've got a whole bunch of questions. What I think it would be useful to do is, we're never going to get them all covered this evening. So what I will do is make a note. I've made a note of all the questions. We'll send them to our two speakers, and when we get their answers, we'll publish them, if with their permission, on the Sabeel website, along with a copy of the link to our webinar, so that people's questions are being answered. We're not we're not ignoring them. There's just an awful lot of them, which is fantastic. And one of the questions, Santiago, was, would you be prepared to share your PowerPoint in a way that allows us to, if we, either use it ourselves or use it as a basis for further information and sharing further information. So we'll send you separately on that, Santiago, because I think a lot of information in that people are saying would be able to, they'd like to be able to reflect on it rather than just try to absorb it in one webinar. A number of the questions are around how this historical context of Islamophobia is playing into the current Hamas and worldwide situation. There's two elements that I'd like to just throw in. One is, although I'm living in Australia, I'm a Brit from England, which is not something I'm proud of anymore. But we have two positions: a prime minister and until recently a home secretary, both coming into Britain, not being born in Britain, but coming into Britain as they describe themselves as immigrants. That's their language. And both using that as a tool to claim that racism can't be alive in Britain because we have the most diverse political party, because we now have an Indian-based prime minister and so on. And so it's being politicized, this sense of originating from outside of Britain. How is that playing into the Hamas situation right now? Either one of you. Iskander.
Sure. Okay, so I mean, I think, yeah, in the Western, including Israeli psyche, I mean, Hamas is like the worst historical boogeyman of the Palestinian South. Islamophobia is very central there. It's very central, but as Palestinian, and this is not rational. I mean, it's part of a political program. It's part of a racist ideology. But Hamas and other Islamist organizations are part of Palestinian life and civil society. They are part of the Palestinian national movement. And it's this claim of Hamas, it's really being used as a red herring, because they have said this when it's been secular Palestinian nationalist acts of resistance. I mean, they say this about, they said this about Yasser Arafat. They say this about Layla, both from, secular formations inside Palestine. So I don't think there's anything unique in the broader sense of the boogeyman of Hamas in relation to the wider Palestinian body politic in one sense. In another sense, I think there is a way that the terrain shifted in the last 30 years, especially from the 90s forward, because this is also when Hamas comes into power, or gains power and eventually comes into power. Yeah, those are a few initial thoughts I have on that question.
Okay, thank you. And Santiago, you?
Yeah, if I can follow a little bit, I have been reading a little bit the questions here, okay? And a few questions, if you don't mind, I can start there and later on I answer directly. The question is, some of the questions from Berula of asking here, is power co-opting in religion? Or Dorothy said, that Zionism is not Christianity because Jesus having inclusive of all people. I do understand these expressions, and I believe that if you are coherent to a particular religious tradition, you would like to see your tradition not portraying these elements and fighting for truth. At the same time, I don't know any religion or any social formation that happens there in the sky. All traditions, all religions happen here on land, okay? And as such, there is no purity. There are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, there is any political collective has got things to say, problems, so there is nothing that is ideal, there is nothing that is pure. Why I am saying this? I am saying this because Hamas has done so welfare work that is very extended in Palestine, especially in Gaza. The time that they could run elections, they won the elections. Of course, they couldn't keep running them because of the situation. And there are certain things that probably some of us might not be comfortable with. At the same time, the question we need to ask there is which violence we are comfortable with and which violence we are not comfortable with. What we call violence and what we don't call violence. We are used that the violence, when it's exercised by a nation state, is considered legitimate. When a violence is perpetrated by someone else, is considered it's not legitimate. So when we confront these situations, I want to think what narratives are out there and not what is or is not. If Hamas is a Palestinian representation or is not, is X or is not. I don't care about the is or is not because things are never pure. I care about what narratives, what in political interest are supporting which narratives. So when I hear we need to go to Gaza to save Palestinians from Hamas, I cannot but think when Spaniards and Portuguese were saying we need to go to the Americas in order to save natives from human sacrifices. Or when it was a justification that we need to go to the Middle East in order to save Muslims for autocracy or dictatorships. Or makes sense? Or they came in the 60s and 70s to Latin America, the US, and they said we need to go there in order to spare people from communism. Okay, so there has been a long-standing narratives where people with Western power legitimate their violence by saying they are saving people from their leaders. So I am not so much concerned about what is or what is not Hamas. I am concerned about the narratives about Hamas and what political implications they have. As a center of liberation theology had very differences, much differences across traditions, across things, but there is something at the central, which is a preferential option for the oppressed, which means in particular situation, you are going to see who has the power of violence, of legitimate violence, and who doesn't. And right now, in the context of Israel-Palestine, the question is, which violence is accepted and which violence is rejected? Which violence is defensive and which violence is presented as terrorist? And we are going to see through the lenses of liberation theology, and Saville is traditionally a center of Palestinian liberation theology, where the stand is going to be. It's going to be with those people who are not allowed to resist, those people who are not allowed to have political subjectivity, or those people right now who are not allowed any roof under their heads, or there are people who are not allowed to eat. People are starving when they are not being killed. So from a liberation theology perspective, I will return to this idea that who are the people who are allowed, who are the people who are not allowed. And our preferential option is always going to be with those people which powers, in this case, Western power, doesn't allow them to be.
Thank you.
Can I
I don't know about anybody else here, but my brain's kind of exploding at the minute, which is absolutely fantastic. That's what I wanted. We have quite a few people who are having to leave as time has marched on. So what we'd like to do is to wrap up two ways. One is for Omar just to share with us the details of the next webinar and the conference. And I think we have a poster that we can share screen with Omar. I've got it if you want to make me co-host, and then Stephen will finish with a prayer. So Omar, over to you.
Hi, Mark. First, you're already co-host, Mark.
Oh, thank you.
So, last year, or for a number of years, Sabir was considering of the importance of doing a conference specifically on the topic of religious extremism. Religion can be something that is wonderful, a catalyst that would help us to do something good, but also could be something that is very problematic and one of the root causes of the problems. We have to admit that most people who follow religion are normal people. We're all similar, whether we're Muslims, Christians, Jews, or regardless of the background that we come from, most people are good, want to be good neighbors and want to be treated and treat people in a nice way. But we also have to admit that all religions have some problematic texts, traditions, histories, narratives, and that is complicated. In this conference that is scheduled to take place in November in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, it will be held in person. We will try to address religious extremism, how religion is used and misused and manipulated to justify atrocities, genocide. Religion can bring the worst out of us and can bring the best of us. So that is what we're trying to do. Liberation theology is trying to courageously tackle these issues. And it's much more important than protecting dogma or traditions to protect the humanity and the dignity of one another. Next, we have the first webinar we had it addressed how anti-Semitism is misused or weaponized to attack, to silence Palestinians or to attack anybody who is willing to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people or for human rights. Today, we had a wonderful webinar. Thank you for our guests, where we addressed Islamophobia and how the Muslim has become the enemy of the world, sadly, in recent history. Next month, we are addressing the issue of, we're addressing from a Christian perspective, the fear of Christianity, the attacks on Christianity, and the persecutions of the Christians. It does not ignore that Christianity, some interpretations of Christianity was used to justify imperialism and justify colonialism and to justify genocide against many people, but also many people of the Christian faith have been abused and continue to be abused and persecuted for their faith. It's a complicated world where we live in, sadly. So next month, we are having a number of wonderful speakers. We have our friend, Rabbi Brent Rosen. We have Paul McAllister and our good friend, Waltrina Middleton, who will be addressing the topics of Christophobia and the persecution of Christians. These webinars are only just, we're just trying to address first the conference as preparation for the conference. We're aiming and we're hoping that many of our friends from around the world, the delegations would be coming to Jerusalem, similar to any previous Sabir conferences, that people will come together. And we meet and we learn not only from the speakers who are an authority on these topics, but from one another. We are a grassroots organizations, and this is what we believe in. We all are trying to become better people, better neighbors, and your presence with us would definitely make it an easier and a more enjoyable journey. Nobody likes to self-reflect, but if we have a nice group around us, I think that would make it a little bit more fun of an experience. Thank you.
So if you have access to the Sabir website, any of the Friends of Sabir websites around the world and the main Sabir website in Jerusalem, you will find details of the conference, how to register, what the costings are, and the dates and times, etc. And we will soon be sending out a detailed program of events over the days, and with the speakers that have been confirmed, and we're still working on it. If any of you feel that you would like to join us and have something to offer as a speaker and you've not been approached, please do send the information through to Omar and Stephen, and we'll certainly look at that. That'd be great to have you. But please do come and register for the conference as well as the webinars. So thank you so much for today. We really appreciate it. Stephen?
Thank you, Mark. And please, if you want to know more about the conference and preparing for these webinars, do get hold of Naeem Atik's booklet, Challenging Religious Extremism, which is available through the FOSNA website, Friends of Seville North America. I think it's $1 to download. It's well worth $1. Please make use of that, read it, and be prepared for the following webinars, as Omar and Mark have said, preparing us for the conference in November. So thank you to our two speakers tonight, Iskander and Santiago, and we look forward to dialoguing with you further at our conference in November. But we want to close our webinar with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we praise and thank you for the opportunities we have through modern technology to dialogue with each other around the world on these important issues, especially the destructive element of religious extremism, which is causing so much suffering. We thank you for the reminder today of the historical context and the role Christians have played in fermenting and exacerbating tensions between our faith communities. We grieve for the suffering that has been caused and is being caused today by religious extremism in Palestine and Gaza especially. We ask that you would show us how we can be peacemakers, how we can fulfill a ministry of reconciliation and bring love and forgiveness, justice, peace, and reconciliation to particularly to Palestine. Please show us how we can work together to bring about peace and justice in our world today. We ask this for your glory. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.